To jump right in, just break the ice. I just did a quick bio. Tell us something about yourself that might not show up like on your LinkedIn profile or in the official bio.
Right. So I actually I don't know how to ride a bike. I never learned how to ride a bike. I got to the point when I was a kid where the training wheel, I think I had one training wheel on, and that one training wheel was supposed to come off, and I was supposed to be riding, but it never happened. So as a result, as an adult, my ex-boyfriend tried to teach me. We got through 4 lessons before it ended badly. I had a scar on my knee.
Ex-boyfriend.
No, that too. But yeah. So yeah, still haven't learned.
Wow.
Waiting to one day learn.
Can't ride a bike, but I bet you could design a pretty good bike, right? Another thing. So Mimi Chun, your middle initial is O. And I did some just Googling of you, and I discovered at another interview where you revealed that the O doesn't actually stand for anything, and it was just that your mother really liked the design aesthetic of the letter O. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of like design has been baked into who you are from birth. So tell us a little bit about your growing up and how you thought about design.
So my mother's a painter. My father's a computer scientist. So my ending up in design is like. My sister's she was an architect. Now she's a potter, but she was an architect. So yeah, we both always like to joke that we landed right in the middle between my parents. My mother's maiden name was actually O.H., but for my middle name she dropped the H because she just liked the graphic nature of the O. Yeah. Which is pretty much how it happened.
And so did you always know that you were going to be involved in design as a career, or?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think that when I was in high school, I was really interested in things like design, but I was in the arts, but I was also interested in science, and actually I think I applied to 9 schools, 7 of which were for the science route, and only 2 of which were for design. I ended up doing my undergrad at Carnegie Mellon because you could apply to 2 colleges within the university. So I applied to Mellon College of Science and College of Fine Arts, got in for both, figured if I hated one, I wouldn't have to move anywhere, I could just transfer within the university. So I started in design because I knew if I started in science that I'd be taking all these core foundational classes, and it would take me a while before I figured out whether or not I liked it, whereas I knew with design it was deep dive right into it. I'd figure it out pretty quickly, and I think I knew I don't know, probably that first semester that it was the thing that could encompass virtually every other interest I had.
So before we dive into the topic discussion that we're here, let's define some terms. So a really hot term now in the startup world is design thinking. How do you, if someone asks you, how do you explain that term to them? What does that mean?
It probably means a lot to my sort of understanding of it is it's a methodology that you can use that is inspired, I guess, by design practice, where you can help to solve. It's basically problem-solving methodology. Inspired by design. So there's sort of key phases. It's both convergent and divergence, meaning at times you're narrowing, at times you're generating and going broad. But it starts by defining a problem, then going out there and doing a bunch of user research, having a lot of empathy for your end users, and then generating ideas. There's a lot of brainstorming, the idea that you're not necessarily attached to any one particular idea, but you're rather just being super generative. And then going out, building prototypes of those ideas, testing them, and then sort of repeating it throughout. But it's a sort of multi-phase methodology, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here. Sometimes it gets applied to, sometimes it's misapplied, I should say, to just sort of the art and creative world or just to technology. Is your notion of design something that is applicable beyond just technology?
Absolutely. I think of design as not necessarily design thinking is about sort of democratizing that process, so it's not just the domain or the purview of somebody who has a degree in design, but rather it's something that can be embraced by, virtually any person who has a specific sort of functional background. It doesn't matter. It kind of broadens it and makes it available to everyone.
Right. And so what we're really getting at in this idea is that I think there's this traditional sense of design that, and tell me, audience, if this is something that you may have thought about, but like the traditional sense is design is maybe something that happens after the fact. Like, a startup founder, or, who's maybe focused on technologies, builds something, and then after the fact, it's like, oh, let's get a designer to make it look pretty or something like that. And that is the kind of the thought process that we're trying to move beyond, and we're trying to get design at the table from the beginning. So to get at that, so what are the pitfalls of that traditional way of thinking versus the benefits of this new way of thinking?
It's not that this is not in any way to diminish like the role of the designer who's had a traditional education design, like in the finer points of design, who has studied design. It's more just actually applying some of the sort of instincts of a design practice to problem solving early on in the organization. So I think that it's not that I'm saying designers who study, traditional forms of design shouldn't exist or should never be called in to work on a project. It's rather that everyone can be a designer, everyone can sort of embrace the design process, and there will come, just in the same way that at IDEO, one of the things we used to talk about was this notion of the T-shaped person. There's a person who has a specific depth in one area, whether they're a subject matter expert in that area, whether it's a specific discipline, but then they also have the bar of the T, which is about having breadth and being able to sort of solve. Being able to not just like be called in for the specific functional expertise, but actually being able to solve problems at a broad level.
In some ways, I think about it because I'm new even to the phraseology in the last few years, and we were talking about this yesterday. In some way, it's a learning paradigm, right? It's putting something out there, listening to the users or the attendees even, and getting that feedback early in the process versus saying, I'm going to build it and they'll come and it'll just be fine. I'll solve all the things at the beginning with a whole realm of assumptions. And so that's a very different approach to building things today. When you think about that, how do you advise early stage founders about when they should be thinking about that process?
I think it's from the beginning. I think it can be used. You can use user research to test a hypothesis. Before anything gets built, before you incorporate, before anything happens, you should be thinking about getting out there in the field, talking to people. I mean, I think it's great to have a hypothesis of like, I think there's an opportunity here, let me go out there and test it. Another sort of big tenet of design thinking is this, it's like the fail faster to succeed sooner. So it's like rapidly building prototypes of things, even if they're not perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good, all of that sort of stuff. And just sort of getting it out there and getting feedback as quickly as you can.
Let's bring some real world examples into it. So you were design director at General Assembly in New York. Does everyone know what General Assembly is? Do you want to first maybe just give a brief explanation of what the company is, but then talk about how you baked in design right from the get-go and how that impacted the General Assembly's ability to succeed?
Sure. So I think today General Assembly, and I think we launched in January of 2011. So today I think General Assembly would tell you it is about providing a 21st education, bringing 21st education to people where perhaps our traditional education, traditional liberal arts education, some of the gaps that are there, like whether it's learning skills whether it's web development skills, whether it's product management, digital marketing, places where there's gaps in our current education system or things that are learned on the job. I think General Assembly's mission is to be able to supply those skills to people regardless of where they are in their career. I basically helped I was actually at IDEO when I met one of the founders of General Assembly, and he was simultaneously applying to business school, thinking about starting this company that ended up turning into General Assembly, and then also applying at IDEO, and that's how we initially met. I like to say that so I started working with him because I was interested in startup and interested in particularly interested in startups as a path forward for young designers. I think I sort of grew up in an era where design, the career options for designers were you go into client services or you go work in-house. And here all of a sudden was this sort of third option, which was really interesting to me, that gave a lot of authorship to the designer. And so to be a founder. So I started working with those guys. Initially, I was like, I'll help you guys with, my experience is half in brand and half in product service innovation. So I was like, I'll work on your brand. I just want to learn a lot about your company, and then, or what it is that you're trying to do. And I like to say that I woke up in Vegas with a wedding ring on my finger, like having left IDEO like all of a sudden, and to join them full time in their endeavors. So we started. Do you want to know like the?
Well, yeah. So since they obviously recognize the importance of design from the start, tell us about how that impacted their ability to grow and as Jess said, learn, because if they had just gone ahead and done what they wanted to do and then brought in a designer at the end, it might have turned out differently. So.
Yeah, I think it was a learning process for all of us. One of my connection to General Assembly was, this one of the founders, but I think for the other founders, they maybe had more traditional notions around what design was. So it was a learning process for both of us. I was learning about startups, they were learning about design, how it could be applied. So when we started, it was based on tons of conversations. They knew that they wanted to create, in the beginning, the vision was to create a community for like-minded entrepreneurs. The education thing was not a huge part. They knew that there would be this sort of osmotic knowledge transfer that would happen internally within their members. So when they started, it was basically community, a co-working space. The co-working part of it was actually a huge part of it, and then a little bit of event programming, I think, was the original vision. They got a grant from the New York Economic Development Council to build, I think Bloomberg was like very pro this idea of New York being a technology hub and the businesses that were coming out of it, so they were super supportive of us in the beginning. But yeah, so I think that over time, GA's business kind of evolved into the education part. Like, it's funny because if you look at the first footprint of our space, we had our first campus, we had a 16,000 square foot space, only like 400 or 500 of which was classroom space. Now, if you look at subsequent campuses that they've created in LA or in other cities, that's pretty much reversed, where they've kind of evolved their model, so the co-working is less a part of their model and it's much more focused around education.
So great example, just to underline that, just a great example of you think you know what the market wants. You even have a ton of boosters, right? The city's clamoring for more tech workers, so this is what it's going to be, and everybody's signing off on all the co-working. Mm-hmm. Then lo and behold, they're somewhat overwhelmed by the demand for actual classrooms, right, for people to take them. And now, I think they're in something like 27 cities around the world, all the way to Singapore, and so it's one of those great examples that we were talking about yesterday when we were discussing it, where, again, even some of the most cutting-edge companies, if you have an open mindset about what the market is giving you for feedback, you can pivot, you can adjust, and be successful. Because that's a lot of overhead if they hadn't pivoted at that point, right, in order to be successful.
Right. When I introduced you, I failed to mention, I said you're a startup founder. The startup you're working on right now is called Loveback. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about Loveback, but as well as your role as a kind of designer on the founding team, and how that might differ in your experience as, say, a consultant or advisor being a designer versus a designer on the founding team?
Sure. So it's funny because with General Assembly, I actually joined the founders. While I wasn't a founder, I joined that team about 7 months before we actually opened our doors. So in many ways, I felt that level of that commitment and that accountability was definitely. I had definitely experienced that with General Assembly. Loveback is my first, on paper, my first venture into entrepreneurship. So I think there's, it's funny, I think there's a level of accountability as a founder. Well, having been a consultant before and worked in teams, highly collaborative teams, there's a little bit of, this is going to sound bad, but there's a little bit of a common enemy, that being your client, or it's not even a common enemy, but it's you're instantly on the same team and you're working towards an end goal. Whereas with when you're working on a startup, it's really for me, it's 2 co-founders in a room. So I have 2 other co-founders, so it's 3 of us in a room, and it's about knowing that we are ultimately all equally accountable for getting stuff done. I think it's just it's a different, as a consultant, the most you can do is essentially make recommendations and cross your fingers that the client sort of sees the value in it. But even at IDEO, we used to talk about clients with big drawers where your presentation or your vision of the future would just get filed in a big drawer. And certainly as a founder, you can't do that.
Right. So how about talk about some advice for startup founders in the room. How should they stage their investment in design? Because I assume that's a question that some people might have. I mean, I'm a startup, I'm not a designer. How do I incorporate it early in the process, even if I don't have a lot of funds?
To go back to my earlier point around design not necessarily being the purview of just somebody who has a background in design, I think there's a lot of things that you can adopt from design thinking in terms of process, in terms of defining your problem, in terms of conducting user research. That's it's free, it's cheap, and certainly worth doing. And then in terms of, it's funny, around the, I was reading some blog that talked about for every $1 spent in UX at the onset of a company is $10 to $100 either earned through repeat customer business or saved from when you have to redesign something once it's launched. So I understand that money is about when you're bootstrapping a company, it's about timing and where you can and when you can invest.
Right.
But I think there's something kind of compelling about here is it's a worthwhile investment.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
So, does everyone know what UX means? Does anyone not know what UX means? Not to point anyone out, but okay, I do see a hand. So let's define some terms. So UX is user experience.
Right.
And so we're designing how consumers will interact with your product, whether that's software or a physical, or it could be considered
a conference. Physical. Could be a conference.
Right. Anything with user experience. So it's interesting. So how does design differ? The way you think about it, or design thinking, how you apply it, when you're talking about, say, just designing a brand versus designing, say, a product?
I think that it's funny because I think that with brands there's a certain amount of art and science. I mean, there's an art and science to both designing a product or designing an experience, designing an environment, and then designing a brand. But I think there's something around when you're trying to understand, you can do user research in service of both, understanding what people need, understanding what their latent needs, what their behaviors are, what their attitudes are towards certain things. But when it comes to brand creative, meaning the visual creative, I actually find that it's more art than science. I think there's a little bit of versus with product experience, where I'm absolutely, a big proponent of, understanding, doing usability studies, really understanding, are you is this thing going to function in the way that is it going to inspire the right behaviors on behalf of the user? When it comes to brand, I think you can do things like you can test messaging, you can test, there's other parts that you could, but in terms of like testing a logo, probably like it's a little bit, I don't know, it's not quite apples to apples in terms of the last thing you want with a digital product, with a space, you want to make sure that it's usable, that it's comfortable, that it's delightful, all of these things. When it comes to a logo, you want to make it memorable and you want to make it differentiated. And neither of those things necessarily come from feedback from a user.
Okay.
I think one of the great examples, at least that I remember around UX is, some of you might remember, when the healthcare.gov website was launched and everyone was like, this is a disaster, and there are 17 screens or 23 screens until you get, and all these people were sort of, they get through 5 and then they go away, basically. And we were talking about this yesterday. It was one of those moments for me of sort of understanding the world is when they did bring in a whole new design team and they reduced the number of screens from something like 17 to 5. And all of a sudden the take rate, the users who went all the way through the process. So that to me is such a tangible experience, but it's also that experience or that interaction between the brand and the actual user experience, because the brand was dying. Right. In many ways because of that experience. And the brand has been turned around in some ways because no one's talking about having a terrible user experience anymore.
Right.
And
yeah, I think that brings up a good point, which is that brand is not necessarily something. I think there's a tendency in larger organizations to see brand as distinct, or it's generally, with larger organizations, we have a tendency to silo like functional units within an organization, and brand is typically not necessarily sitting even in the same place as product. And so, but at the end of the day, like brand and product should always be in dialogue with one another, and ideally, speaking the same language. Mm-hmm. It's not, Yeah,
and it really gets to the healthcare.gov example, really gets to that investment, because if that was a for-profit company, there goes suddenly your subscribers, actually paying revenue. Let's see, what should we talk about now? So many topics. How about talk about one of your most memorable aha moments working with startups. And it can be design related, or I guess it doesn't have to be, but.
I think this is an aha moment. I don't know that it's a positive aha moment, but it was a little bit of an aha moment. So during the very beginning of General Assembly, when I think we were operating, so here we were about to launch this new thing that hadn't been done before. We had a press embargo because we were running an exclusive with the New York Times. And so everything was like kind of on, we were functioning, we had members in our space, but nobody was allowed to tweet or, Instagram anything or anything like that. And there was this thing and I had left IDEO to join General Assembly. And one of the reasons why I left was, as a designer, I always wanted to have palpable impact on my end users. That was like my primary MO. And so it was here at General Assembly where this thing kept happening where people would be talking about, there's a lot of glass in that New York office. People kept running into the glass. They would talk to one another about how other people were running into the glass, and then they themselves run into the glass 2 seconds later. Like there's a lot of floor to ceiling glass. And I had this moment where after however many, where I was freaking out, and I was like, this is what it means to be accountable. This is what it means to, to suddenly have palpable impact on end users, maybe not in the
Actual
right way.
Impact, right?
Exactly. So I'm like running around putting Post-its on every glass surface to make sure that nobody's running until while I produce some of that fake frost signage or whatever. But that was that was definitely a big moment for me.
That would be a perfect in a Silicon Valley episode or something like
Totally.
that. I could see that happening.
I think it was a Far Side cartoon once with a guy pushing on it like this and it says pull. It's a little old for some of you guys. I know.
The Far Side, what's that?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It was a cartoon, people. But we were talking about this yesterday. One of the things you keep seeing over and over again with some of the startups you're talking about is also how they're designing their teams. Can you talk a little bit about some of those insights?
So I think that
why does team matter?
Why does team matter? Team matters in a lot of ways. I think like in the early stages of startups, you're so consumed with like the product vision and what's going to happen with the product. But after a certain point in time, if you're successful, that same team needs to suddenly be thinking about an organization. And how do you set up your organization in a way for growth? How do you set up your organization in a way where new employees, especially in a high growth company, you're hiring like crazy, you need people to be able to rally behind your vision or behind your purpose. And I think there's a tendency to be very inward focused and to assume that everybody's on the same page and everybody's on the same speaking the same language, but all of a sudden you're faced with this you're in a phase where it has to be about communicating internally, making sure that people are aligned.
We were again talking about this a little bit yesterday about the importance. So design thinking is not only a process for a learning process for particular products or platforms, but also in how you design as you were describing how you're designing your team. It's also you're sort of cultivating your team as a founder to be one of the best learning units, right? Because as a founder-driven company, there's this big debate between founder-driven companies and non-founder-driven companies. You have to, again, go from that, sleeping in your car to flying around pitching everybody to the fact that you're in charge of. We were joking yesterday, just a funny story. She was talking about another company that she was at. She was talking about being an early stage company or early stage employee at another company, and I said, when there was like 40 employees, and she said, no, I was employee 800 or something like that,
Yep.
which early stage 800 employees here. I was like, little perspective.
Right.
But that learning unit, that management team, or that team beyond the singular founder is such a critical component.
Right. Absolutely.
We've talked a lot about baking this design thinking into startups, right, from the beginning. What about people that work at, say, larger corporations, legacy organizations? Do you have any advice for those people to try to incorporate design thinking into those types of organizations? I don't know if you have experience with them, like through IDEO. Or
yeah, sure. With
but
IDEO, we consulted with primarily like Fortune 500, 100 market leaders. I think, it's funny, design is something that, I used to talk about this a lot with one of the co-founders from General Assembly, how design is it's a value, or he was interested in creating companies where design was a value, not a function, so that it didn't stay, I think a lot of organizations, a friend of mine was doing a study on looking at innovation within organization, looking at the different models in which innovation happens within organizations. Right. Sometimes it's an internal consulting group within a larger organization. Sometimes it's tools that enable sort of like bottom-up innovation to happen and that are spread out throughout. There's a lot of sort of knowledge sharing tools that are being created to sort of help get, be able to pass information from team to team throughout a large organization. I think that, and then there's also, one of the things that we used to talk about at IDEO was not just, there's so many ways in which you can encourage or inspire the right type of environment for design. And sometimes, we had clients that would create dedicated spaces that were almost like innovation labs within these sort of larger organizations where people could kind of see what was happening or see the problems, invite participation, like draw on a Post-it what you think, how we might answer this problem. There's just like a number of ways that you can facilitate that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, just it was interesting last year at PopTech, John Maeda from RISD said this quote, which I think is fascinating, that said, any type of organization, nonprofit, for-profit, legacy corporation, startup, if you are expecting to be around for another year or 18 months in today's world with the movement of information, if you're not incorporating design thinking in how you're interacting with your customers and users, you're dead. Mm. Is that crazy? Is that, do you agree with that?
I think, well, it's funny because at IDEO I do agree with that. I think at IDEO we saw a lot of, we used to talk about different sort of project typologies that we would get. Some that were like designing the future. So an example of that is a client would come to you and say, how will people be interacting with their financial information 15 years down the line? Then we'd have projects that were about designing the business. So we think there's an opportunity at the intersection of education and entertainment in financial services. What might that look like? Then there's designing the experience. Now design what that, whatever that opportunity is. Like, let's say that's a mobile app, design that experience. And then there's also bringing the experience to market. And one of the things I remember, because I was at IDEO around 2008, and I remember feeling like a lot of the project briefs were changing to be a lot more near term. So it was a lot more about bringing the experience to market, when in fact, like, perhaps at that point in time, people should actually be looking a little bit, like, looking towards the future and looking at asking the bigger questions. I think it's hard, obviously, it's like our instinct to sort of get a little bit more near term, let me figure this out, let me get past this hurdle. But I think some of the best, what is it? Is it Google X's, their mission is to constantly redefine the mission of Google?
Yep.
Right, so yeah, companies that are like looking at the long term and actually thinking about their space within culture, like is an important thing.
Which must be a very hard thing to do, especially in those, the models of, especially as you get bigger, right, is you've got product market fit, so you're building everything in your organization to reproduce that widget. Right, whatever that thing is, or your HR systems, your procurement systems. We were talking about this earlier in the corporate innovation panel, and yet you still have to, in order really to survive. I mean, look at Kodak and organizations like that who totally missed the digital photography movement, so to speak, or innovation. And so I think it's just an interesting idea about, regardless of the area that you're in, it's an applicable process and approach, but you have to make space for it. Because if you don't, everything else is just going to go past you.
Exactly.
Right. So, design thinking, I mean, it's a term now, but aspects of it have been around for a long time, right? It's just more of a, maybe we're like naming it design thinking and making it popular. What do you think has driven this widespread adoption of design thinking? Has it been a few successful companies, or has it been?
Oh, it's interesting. I think probably there's been like we're facing a more and more crowded space. So I think that's, design in some ways, like I think only recently has been recognized as a differentiator for a lot of companies, and. There are companies that sort of differentiate based on their technology. There are companies that differentiate based on as the space gets more crowded, that differentiate based on their experience. So I think there's a little bit of that. I think we're just getting smarter, and we're using more things, and it's a zero-sum game, and we're constantly looking at a new thing, trying to figure out if this means that, we have to stop using that other thing. I think it's getting to the point where the things that are delightful, easy to use, intuitive are always going to rise to the top.
Right. I wonder if also this new movement, since sort of the rise of the internet and the digital age, the movement of people, right? It's no longer where you live in one city and you work in one place, and that's what that's your thing. Right, that doesn't really exist anymore. Right. So the ability, sort of, everybody is. There used to be a joke when I was growing up that you're going to have 10 jobs. I had 10 jobs 5 years ago. Right. And I can keep a job, just for the record. But the reality of it is that people are moving very quickly between the things in their lives. So we're exposed to a whole slew of new things. So if you're not thinking about that, right, that interaction with whatever you're doing, whether it's designing your neighborhood or designing a product, people are just going to go find it someplace else.
Right.
Mm-hmm. What about any sort of other resources or advice for people in the room that want to either pursue this, want to integrate it into their startups, or just learn more? Is there any?
I'm sure there are resources out there.
Yeah.
I know that IDEO, I think they produce like a human-centered design guide that can help you, that sort of outlines the steps. I'm sure there's a lot. I mean, there's tons of stuff online in terms of.
So I found something last night. Just sorry, I forgot to mention this. So IDEO is doing a design thinking course for free
on IDEO.
Yep, and it's linked to
Right.
I think it's through Stanford. It's a collaboration with Stanford, and so people can get that for free. They can. I mean, you have to sit in front of your monitor, but you can learn this stuff, and along with the guide that you talked about.
Right.
And there's the thing going up in Gold Academy.
Yep.
I don't know if people know, but there's a what do they call it? I forget.
Field guide.
Field guide.
Going on right now.
Right, and it'll become an annual thing, and hopefully it won't be the same week as Maine Startup and Create Week. But that's going on in Gould Academy. It's all about design thinking, like a 3-day course.
I do think, just a plug for this community, I think one of the interesting things that that this event and some other events have brought out, like TEDx Dirigo and some others, is that the notion of thinking about design has really started to bubble up. And I just, regardless of whether you're a founder or whether you're in a legacy company or you're just interested in this stuff, there are people around here who are doing these things. And for me personally, it has just opened this whole idea and perspective about how we build things. And I just would encourage you to, if you can find somebody here who knows about that or go to one of these events, to really go and sort of immerse yourself in that, because it has been, just for me personally, it's been an incredible eye-opening experience.
Right. What about, you've done a lot, worked with a lot of startups. If you, kind of big picture idea, if you wanted to apply your design thinking, all your experiences to some big, hairy, audacious goal, some moonshot, what would you tackle with design thinking?
Probably redesigning tax forms. That would be the thing.
We can all
that
agree
I would
on
want
that,
to do.
right?
Yeah.
Good traction already.
You'd have probably a lot of red tape to redesign that, though.
That's right.
You have any other questions? You want to open up to audience?
Let's open it up.
Let's open it up to audience questions. Who has a question for Mimi? I think we have a. Do we want to get the handheld mic?
Go ahead. Yeah, let's get that too.
Probably speak loud enough.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that design is a little bit of art, a little bit of science. It's hard to measure the success of art sometimes, right? So from your standpoint, whether it's consulting for a founder, how do you measure the success of something that you've changed through design to see if it's, is there certain metrics that you use to see if something had a positive return on the investment?
I think, when I was talking about the art and science, I think I was talking specifically within the context of brand. There's very measurable ways to look at the usability or the effectiveness of a product. How well, whether you're looking at the analytics of, let's say you have an e-commerce site and you're looking at how well people are converting. All of those things can give you a good litmus test on whether or not it's working. For something like a brand, it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to say, like, we approve of this logo or we don't approve of this. I mean, it's funny because, like, every time any organization, I feel like, goes through a redesign, there's all these haters that come out, right?
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's Uber or Airbnb or Pepsi
Instagram.
or right. But at the end of the day, I'm of the belief that, like, a brand is not necessarily it's not a logo. It's how people talk about what it is that your company does, and that's not built, it's not built on a computer anywhere. It's built on the ground. So.
Good question, James. Anyone else? Up front. We got a microphone coming your way. I'm sure we can hear you. I just want everyone else to be able to hear you.
Thank you. So you've been talking a lot about the possibility of what design does is open up new possibilities and new ideas. Can you talk a little bit about the process of coming to closure?
Sure. So I think design thinking talks about these three things, which is, like, is this business, is this desirable? Or is it something that users want? Is it technically feasible? So do we have the technology to actually make this possible? And then is it viable as a business? And I think that there's certain criteria, and each organization might have specific criteria that that whatever they produce needs to address. So I think it is about, while design thinking sort of definitely promotes this deferred judgment, generate a lot of ideas, there is this point where you're looking at, okay, how big is this opportunity from a market sector, from a market perspective, is this, one of my favorite sort of frameworks is how much, is a 2x2 of looking at, let's say you've created all of these possibilities. On the x-axis you have implementation. Is it easy to implement, or is it difficult to implement? Let's start with difficult here and easy here. And then on the y-axis, you have how much does it move the needle for the user experience? Is it moving it in a really great, in a really positive way? And obviously, like when you map your ideas, like you can look at sort of, if the ideas that are perhaps easier to, in an ideal world, ideas that are easier to implement and move the needle for customer experiences, of course, those are no does. But you might choose something that's actually difficult to implement because it has profound, impact on the user. So I think like it's up to, those things are in some ways determined by what the objectives are of each individual organization. I assume each organization will have a different set of criteria by which they can evaluate ideas.